Okay, so we're going to get started. Welcome to the DataONE Webinar series. We're very honoured to have Dr. Cameron Nealon as the speaker for this month in the series. My name is Amber Budden, and I am the Director of Community Engagement and Outreach at DataONE. So for those of you that are not familiar with DataONE, I just wanted to give you a little bit of information. DataONE is an NSF-funded, community-driven cyber infrastructure project. We provide integrated network access across multiple data repositories, supporting enhanced search and discovery of Earth and environmental science data. Now, the DataONE vision is to enable new science and knowledge creation through universal access to data about life on Earth and the environment that sustains it. We currently have 26 member nodes or repositories within the network. And information on the data that is discoverable through DataONE can be found at this second URL. You can see all of the member nodes and information about the member nodes at that first URL. In addition to infrastructure and tool development, we also have a very active education and outreach program. There's many resources that are available to you online, and notable among these are the education modules, which you can download and use in your teaching practices. And they have accompanying one-page synopses and exercises with data that you can use to support that education process. And of course, we also have the DataONE Webinar series that launched last month. So I'd like to pass over to Dr. Yiwei Wang. She will be introducing the webinar and also our speaker for today. Thank you.
Thank you, Amber.
Thank you, Amber. Before we get to our main event, I want to direct you to a few important links that are at the top of the slide. These will let you register for our upcoming webinar and allow you to view previous webinars and participate in the community discussion forum. Please mark your calendars for our next webinar, which will feature a panel presentation by Martin Fenner and Dr. Jennifer Lin from PLOS and Matt Jones from NCs and DataONE. They will be discussing and demoing Make Data Count, an exciting NSF-funded project to design and develop metrics that track and measure data use. Lastly, before I introduce our speaker, I would like to ask anyone who's viewing this webinar as part of a group to please type your group size into the question box on your control panel. This will help us keep track of how many attendees we're getting. Now, I'm very pleased to be introducing Dr. Cameron Nealon, who currently serves as the Advocacy Director for the Public Library of Science, or PLOS. Cameron is trained as a biophysicist and received his PhD from the Australian National University in 1999. He has always worked in interdisciplinary areas and been a dedicated advocate of open research practice and improved data management. He joined PLOS in 2012 and currently plays a key role in shaping the organization's organizing, educational, and outreach activities. After his presentation, we will have about 15 minutes for questions. Please type any questions for Cameron into your GoToWebinar control panel. Any questions that we don't get to will be posted to the online community discussion board on the DataONE website, which we encourage you to visit in the next couple of days. So now I'm going to hand over the controls to Cameron so that he can give his wonderful presentation.
So thanks very much for the opportunity to speak to this group, and I thank you also to all those people who I know that there was more than one competing event on today, and that several of you might have been not at the Research Data Alliance plenary or DigiFest in the UK. So I appreciate you making the time to come along for this. This is a new talk for me, and it's a bit of a departure. It's a set of new ideas as I've come to try and understand how we can actually drive the kind of changes in scholarly communications practice that as a community we've been advocating for some time, and in many cases we now have the policy and legislative environment in place, and in some cases even the infrastructures to support that. But actually making the change in practice has been something of a challenge, and in my view will continue to be something of a challenge. So we need to figure out how to make that work. And so these are sort of really just where my ideas are right at the moment. I'll explain some of these ideas are less than a couple of weeks old at the moment. So I'll take you through those, and hopefully we'll make good time and have plenty of time for questions. I want to start with a statement from Andy Sterling. Andy Sterling is a sociologist and political scientist based at the Step Centre at the University of Sussex. And he makes this really interesting statement in a presentation he gave where the video is online. It's at that link, where he says, if you want to understand the political tensions in a community, probe its origin myth. And I take this to also mean the challenges of cultural change and collective action. But certainly there are political tensions around data sharing and open access and how we fund these things. So maybe we should take this direction and look at our own origin myth. And you heard a version of this in the last webinar. So let me tell you a story about the story we tell ourselves. And the story goes something like this. So once upon a time, in a far-off kingdom, there lived a man, and his name was Henry Oldenburg, and he started a journal. Now, if you've ever been to any meeting about scholarly communications, you've heard this story before. It is the story that we start with when we want to tell the story that everything has changed, or that nothing has changed, or many other things. There is always that slide. Philosophical transactions on the left, and a modern web-based journal page on the right. I want to tell a different story about a different person, and it's this person, Robert Boyle. He was the 14th son of the Earl of Cork, and he was instrumental in the very early days of the Royal Society, in fact, before it was the Royal Society, and in fact, before there was a king in place in England. This is all around the same time as the tail end of the Civil War in England and the Restoration in 1661. So 1665 is a really interesting date in many ways, as one to pick on, not least because it's 350 years old today. But I don't think it's the point that we really want to pick on. But if you've ever done any chemistry, you will know of Boyle from Boyle's law, probably presented in this form, probably something that you struggled with sitting at those long benches in a chemistry lab doing calculations about how big a balloon would be if you squeezed it or put it under different pressures or those kinds of things. And what this equation says is basically that in a closed system of a gas, that the product of the pressure times the volume is a constant. So if you increase the pressure, you have to decrease the volume. If you increase the volume, you decrease the pressure. And this makes perfect sense in our sort of modern atomic view of the world, or molecular view of the world, as this wonderful animated GIF shows, in as much as we know that gases are made up of particles, and that the pressure is more or less, to first approximation at least, the number of collisions those particles have with the walls of a container. So if we compress the particles into a smaller space, they're going to hit the side of the container more often. And so this makes reasonable sense to anyone who's really got a sense of the world as made up of molecules. Except, of course, that wasn't the case in the 1660s. People were not aware of the fact that the matter was made up of molecules. In fact, it was in many ways a rather strange and quite controversial way of thinking about things. And that's the point I want to make about this model and this law at some level, that it's very difficult for us to place ourselves in the headspace of a 17th century scientist and really think about that. Let me illustrate that with another experiment, again relevant to the work of Boyle. So on the left, you can see a glass tube, and that glass tube has been filled with mercury and then placed in a vessel of mercury, and on the right-hand side I've blown up the top part of that tube, and you can see there's a gap at the top of that tube. Now, if I ask you what that gap is, then I'm pretty sure that the vast majority of you are going to say, well, it's a vacuum. But to a 17th century scientist, there's a very good reason why it's utterly impossible for that space above the mercury in that tube to be a vacuum. And it's not an obvious one. It's not one that's easy for us to wrap our heads around. But the reason is this: you can see through it. Light is traveling through that tube. So if that was truly a vacuum, which in the 17th century was understood to be an empty space, a truly empty space, then there's no way that light, or any of the models they had of light, would be able to travel through something, because there would be nothing for it to travel through. Now we understand that the fields, the electric and magnetic fields that support the passage and movement of light can travel through these spaces. So there's a very real sense in which it's not a vacuum. That space is not a vacuum in the sense in which a 17th century natural philosopher would have thought of it. So our understanding changes, our assumptions about how the world works change, and the models that we just naturally use to explain how the world works have really changed quite radically. But of course, I'm not actually going to talk to you about Boyle's law of gas and thermodynamics. I want to talk to you about the work that he did in really establishing modern science in its current form, or natural philosophy, as it was called then. So the laws that I'm referring to are the laws and the practices that Boyle promulgated and wrote about and promoted as a way of doing science. And in this, I'm leaning very heavily on this book by Stephen Chapin and Simon Schaefer called The Leviathan and the Air Pump, which I recommend as a really great way of understanding what it was that they were trying to articulate at the time about what it meant to do science as we understand it today. And what I want to illustrate is, compared to those really quite difficult to understand physical models of how the world worked, that are very different to the way we think today, that in fact the practices and systems and values that Boyle and others in the early Royal Society were talking about map very closely to the way we think about these things, and that if we focus on the community and the community practices, we might learn a lot more than focusing on this object, the journal itself. So I want to really focus on looking beyond that iconic figure of the first page, the first frontispiece of the first edition of the Philosophical Transactions of the Royal Society, and instead to look to the community and the processes that were behind it, and that really drove the need for a range of different communication mechanisms. This is actually a picture of Gresham College from around the same time. This is where the members of the Royal Society met and did quite a lot of their work at the time. This was a semi-public or public to some people, or people of a certain class kind of place, but it was the place that was where these discussions were held, where these experiments were observed, where people would come in to witness the actual doing of the experiment and discuss what it was that they had seen and what it was that it meant. And that's a bit different to where we are today in terms of worrying about whether you can access the data, whether you understand whether the analysis has been done properly, and exactly what was done in the course of an experiment. So let me give you some examples to that, and I'm going to frame this in a set of 3 of the challenges that we often talk about in scholarly communications. So the first of that is the one I've just mentioned, the fact that we often are concerned about the completeness of the scholarly record today. Is the data available? Is the analysis reproducible in any meaningful sense? Is there enough detail to actually redo the physical experiment? And many of you will know this quote from Buckhart and Donahoe's very well-known piece about WaveLab and reproducible research in their work, in which they say that the problem, implicitly they say that the problem with modern computational science is that the scientific publication has ceased to be anything about the scholarship itself and is just an advertisement for the scholarship, and that the actual scholarship is hidden on the hard drives and in the notebooks of the researchers. And this is interesting because nearly 350 years earlier, this is Boyle talking about, in the introduction to his seminal work on gas pressure, what he called at the time the spring of the air. And what he's saying here is he has to justify the fact that he's actually taking up a lot of space to describe these experiments because he thought it necessary to deliver things so that they might, without mistake and with as little trouble as possible, be able to repeat such unusual experiments. So here we have, right at the beginning of scholarly communication, an obsession with reproducibility of providing sufficient information that people can reproduce, repeat, and certainly understand the work. It's worth noting, for instance, that Boyle spent a lot of money getting the plates, the pictures engraved for this book, so that the apparatus and its setup and its construction could be seen and observed. He worked very hard to make it as clear as possible exactly how the experiment was done, at the expense, in some cases, of spending pages and pages describing things which actually make rather tedious reading today. He then goes on to say that, but even if that's not possible, if it's not possible for people to reproduce the experiment, they must at least be able to get a distinct idea of it, to use it as the basis for further theoretical thinking, to understand, to explore, to criticize, and to discuss how it's working or not working. And so again, this is a very modern view with a little bit of the change in language. You might find this today in a graduate training handbook given to starting off research students to explain to them how they need to describe in sufficient detail what it is that they are doing. So let's take a quick look at the second issue, and this is the one that obviously I've been working on for some time, which is access to literature and distribution of that literature. And I kind of mentioned that Boyle spent a lot of money on the engravings for his book. Of course, in many cases, these books, and there were many books before there were journals, and the journals were in some way very less important for a long time, were actually often funded by the authors. So they would fund the production of the book, and then people would buy, essentially the marginal cost of printing, the copies. So in some ways, this isn't a million miles away from the notion that these days we talk about funding the costs of actually publishing research up front, and then that people have to pay for some of the elements of the per copy cost. In our case, that's access to the net. In their case, it was, in some sense, the printing cost. But I find it interesting that one of the things that Boyle says when replying to someone else, criticisms of his work, he's basically saying in this quote, "I'm sorry, but I haven't had a chance to read absolutely everything on the subject." So there's a very real sense in which there's an expectation that it's reasonable for a researcher in replying and in corresponding and having a discourse to have essentially read and have access to everything that's available. And in fact, he's commenting here that because he was staying in Ireland, no comment on Ireland, that it was difficult for him to get access to those books. So again, in a very real sense, the printing press, the ability to move books around, and the acceptance of the costs up front of making those books available, in a sense, solved the access problem, at least for the small community, the small localized, mainly focused in London and Oxford community, that there was this expectation that you'd read everything before replying. And so then the third thing I just want to touch on is this idea of civility, but how we review work. What is the process of criticism, and particularly bearing in mind, again, this is just after the Restoration. And so the question of whether it is appropriate or politically viable for people to disagree is actually quite a dangerous political statement. There's a strong thread in the philosophy and the political philosophy of the time, mainly exemplified by Thomas Hobbes, which says that the reason why there was a civil war was because there was dissent. Therefore, there is no place in public policy and public discourse for dissent. So to actually say we can disagree about these issues of how the world works was in some ways a radical thing to be saying. And so it created a need to circumscribe the space and the mechanisms and the way in which disagreements could be had, to provide a safe space in which discussion and criticism could take place. And again, it's very interesting to look at Boyle's writing to see how that plays out in practice. So one of the comments he makes in response to a criticism of his work from Franciscus Linus is that because the person who's criticised him, Linus in this case, has used temperate language, has taken an appropriate place, has been polite, that he can comply with his own inclinations and custom of exercising civility, even where I most dissent in point of judgment. So even where we have the most disagreement, we will have a polite discussion because we're talking about the issues and the ideas and not the person. Again, something that you might see in a modern graduate textbook. Tackle the idea, not the person. Here's something from Martin in 2008, the Journal of Scholarly Publishing, talking about his practice in terms of refereeing and making the point that referees' reports are often demoralising to authors, particularly to young authors, and I'll come back to that point. But that it's possible to write a report that is supportive and helpful by saying what is good about a piece and how it can be improved. Again, be polite, tackle the issues, offer opportunities for improvement. It's almost the same thing written over 300 years later. In many ways, the same sentiments. But it goes a little deeper than that. Martin goes on to say further down in that piece something about wanting to always not be anonymous in review, and this is an area of some contention. I'm a great believer in transparency. Others are concerned about how transparency might lead to the potential for attacks in terms of waiving anonymity. But in this case, Martin at least is saying, you know, it's important not to be anonymous because I don't want to be accused of stabbing anyone in the back. I want to have a personal relationship at some level with the author and not be the faceless referee number 3. And it's interesting, again, if I actually go back to the same quote, a slightly extended version of the same quote that I showed you before from Boyle, he makes this really interesting statement in the middle of that. He makes this statement, he feels it necessary to say, I've not met this person before. And that's not something that is necessarily part of our modern thinking. This idea that to have this critical discourse, to have this disagreement, it's important that there be some acquaintance. And he talks about this as being his first acquaintance, and then goes on at some length to say how this person has been appropriate in the way they've worked, they've been diligent in the way they've framed their questions, and then he absolutely rips into the ideas and utterly destroys them, and then finishes by being polite and making some suggestions about how Linus can further his work. But this idea that there should be a personal interaction, that there's a sense of this being a real person, I think is something that's really powerful and is a thread that I'll pull through these. And again, you know, this point of being part of the system, of approaching these questions in the right way. He seems to have more diligently than some others inquired into our doctrine, by which he means this approach of discourse and experimentation and testing ideas. Again, quite a modern concept, though, again, one that some of our colleagues in the humanities might take a bit of issue with, that to be part of the scientific discourse, you have to engage with the scientific method. That's essentially what Boyle is saying. And what he's saying to Linus is, I haven't met you before, but there are these rules of behaviour which we expect as a community, and you have observed those rules of behaviour. So welcome to the club. Welcome to the club of serious natural philosophers, of serious sciences. And so there's a sense of inclusion, of engagement and inclusion. But I used this picture advisedly, given that it's a picture from the 1950s of Cape Town in South Africa football club, because the Royal Society, of course, is an organisation, was an organisation, they're working very hard to move away from this, made up of wealthy white men. And so if we ask the question, you know, are these our values? Is Boyle actually, in the very early modern era, expressing our values in a way that's meaningful to us? We have to address this question of the one value that's clearly missing, which is our modern values of inclusiveness and democracy and diversity. And that is an important question to pose. it's interesting that the Royal Society at its birth had decided there should only ever be 50 members. Obviously, they were all men. The first women weren't invested until the 20th century. And most of them were really quite wealthy. In fact, there was still a social structure that distinguished between those fellows who were properly of the peerage, who were proper peers in that sense, which is interesting in the context of peer review, versus those who were commoners, like Robert Hooke, for instance, who was always there as the person doing all the work, but not necessarily getting as much of the credit for the ideas. And this was a time in which the opinion of a noble was automatically assumed to be of more value than the opinion or views or commentary of a commoner. So that's a real challenge in saying that we can look to Boyle or the early Royal Society as a means of resetting our values, of coming back to the core of what we were doing 300 years ago. But I also want to suggest that actually that homogeneity and exclusivity, the sense that it was a club, was actually part of the reason for success, that there was a collective small group of people who could literally sit around a table and discuss these issues and come to a conclusion and come to a consensus, that in fact is a large part of what made this work in practice. Again, something we've lost over the last 300 years as the research community has scaled up. And so if I pose the question that if we look at Boyle's writings as modern in the sense of articulating many of our modern values of science, then we have to ask what's gone wrong in the intervening 350 years. And I think it's clear from what I've said that my view is that we can trace most of the things that have failed, most of the things that we haven't been able to deliver on those values, to issues of scaling, to issues of the community or the system or the number of pages getting too big to work with the technology of the time. So returning to those three issues that I raised before, I want to talk about those as the three scaling failures that lead us to where we are today. So let's talk about the completeness of the record as a starting point. Here is an article published in 1923. This happens to come from Linus Pauling's PhD thesis, which is actually available online. And what he's doing is trying to determine the crystal structure of this mineral, molybdenite. And there's a very real sense in which that table 1 on the right-hand side is the data. He would have actually taken a sensor, probably a photographic piece of paper, or some sort of scintillation sensor, and he would have physically placed it at different places in the refracted in the reflected beam in this case, and measured where it was and what the intensities are. And, he's writing down strong, weak, medium, strong, and there's a very real sense, and you see this often in papers from the early 20th century and before, that essentially these things are a replication of the lab notebook. All the data is there because the experiments are relatively small. We move on another 30 odd years to another paper which many of you will have seen before, and one of the things that's striking about Watson and Crick's paper on DNA structure is it doesn't have any data. Arguably the data that supports their model comes in the papers that follow it, but from Franklin and others. But there's already an acceptance by the middle of the 50s that you can't be expected to put in all the data. There's no photo of their model. There's an awful lot missing that you'd want to test to see whether their story makes sense. And then, of course, more recently, we get to this point where in the publication that describes the discovery identification, it's not even clear whether we should call it discovery of the Higgs boson, we know that most of the data collected never even makes it onto a hard drive. It's thrown away and filtered out before it's even stored. So we have a scaling problem. We have a problem that as the complexity of the experiments has scaled, they no longer fit it in the container we were trying to put it in. Originally, that was a container that was constrained by print. Now that's less so, but there's still a real question about how we make the whole richness of an experiment fit. So it's a scaling problem, and it's a scaling problem that relates to the technologies and the user interfaces that we have available to us today. Let's talk about access and distribution as the second challenge. So, and I'm going to tell a slightly different story for me around this. It's a different scaling issue, but it's one that has some interesting consequences. So this is a graph of the number of university students per 10,000 capita globally over the course of the 20th century. This has also increased exponentially in the early 21st century. But what you can really see here is essentially an exponential growth, particularly starting after the Second World War. There is a massive growth in the scale of students studying at universities, and this spreads globally. And this was a real problem for publishers. It was particularly a problem for the small scholarly publishers that dominated at the time, often societies, who simply couldn't cope with the distribution problem. There was a real issue of scaling the distribution of journals so that they could reach this rapidly expanding, massively expanding demand for those journal articles, both in education and in further research. And so there's a story we tell about what happened in 1951 when Robert Maxwell acquired Pergamon and turned it into perhaps the first major example of the modern commercial publishing business operating at scale. And we tell this as a tragedy, looking back at it, that the serious crisis that's enveloped us since comes out of this moment where the community infrastructure of publication has turned into a commercial industry of publication. And yet, if you actually talk to people who were operating in publishing at the time, Maxwell was seen as a savior. He in many ways brought that industrial sensibility into the publishing industry, which made it possible for the scholarly publishing community to cope with this scaling. And it's an interesting question to pose whether when we get to 1995, when things start to move online, whether if Maxwell hadn't driven that commercialization of the publishing industry, whether the capital would have been in place to allow the movement of journals online in the way and at the speed that it happened. So there's a very real sense in which the crisis that we face today in terms of costs, in terms of access, and in terms still in some cases of distribution, arise out of an earlier attempt to solve a scaling problem that solved the problem that existed at the time, but led into a whole series of consequences that we're grappling with and struggling with today. So maybe this was necessary. Maybe it was a necessary thing to happen and not necessarily a tragedy. And whether it's sufficiently necessary to justify the problems that we're having to grapple with and try to solve today is another question. Maybe that's something we could talk about in the questions. So let's look at this third issue. And this third issue is perhaps summed up by Google autocomplete. And I swear I did not even vaguely try and cheat this. We know we have problems with peer review. We know that there are challenges both with its effectiveness and efficiency, its speed, its relevance and appropriateness. And I want to argue that a lot of the scaling problem here comes from the fact that we had to invent modern pre-publication peer review because of the simultaneous challenge of needing to publish a lot more content as all of those people who went through university went into research labs. And so there needed to be some form of validation, if for no other reason than there was a limited amount of space in the pages of the journals to publish these things. But what happened as a result is that we lost the human contact that had existed before then, which is exemplified by Boyle's writing and his response to Linus, that this is a human interaction, and a human interaction that's based on trying to improve the work, to be critical, but to engage with the author as a human being. And we lost that because of the simple need to scale. I mean, how many people, you may think you know who the referees of your journal article are, but you will often be most commonly being refereed by people who you don't know and maybe never meet. One option to solve this that has been tried by many people, most recently Nature are trying to do this again. It's been tried in some other high-profile journals, not least PLOS Biology back when it launched, is to deal with the issues of peer review by actually making it less personal, by making it not clear to anyone who's involved in the process. For me, this is actually trying to solve cure the symptom, not the disease. It makes an assumption that we're going to behave badly, rather than saying what are the conditions under which we would expect people to behave the best. And my argument would be transparency and a sense of a human connection, a process of discourse, a process of trying to improve each other's work is the way to drive that process. So we need to ask a question about how could communal review work? How can we use maybe the technologies of the web and social media to improve on this? Not necessarily to change it radically in the way that I and others have been sort of banging on for a decade about how we might do this better or differently, but perhaps just how we could improve the degree to which there's human contact between referees and authors and a sense of being collaborators in improving the work. So that leads us to the obvious question that we would pose is, can web technologies, and particularly social web technologies, solve these scaling problems? A lot of these scaling problems arise from the print paradigm. Some of them arise from the number of people engaged or involved as the number of researchers has scaled out exponentially. But these are things that perhaps, that we might assume, that the web and the internet and social media and social technologies can solve at scale. So to deal with this question of increasing content, increasing the completeness of the record, again, the first point that I made, the obvious answer is to break the print paradigm. Of course, that creates its own scaling problem as we create more and more a greater diversity of objects. And you guys know more about the challenges of creating data publication infrastructures and data sharing infrastructures than I do. But you are facing those scaling issues. How does the right person find the right data with the right provenance information and the right metadata to actually be useful to them? There's some benefit in restricting the amount of publication in as much as it focuses people's attention on those specific precious resources. But this is clearly an opportunity to solve that scaling problem by breaking out of the limitations of the print paradigm that have been a big part of the scaling issue. If we want to solve the problem of access and distribution and discovery in particular, then there are many web technologies that mediate these many-to-many relations, not least the web itself, but certainly that ability to transfer content and make it more available, make it available at lower cost, is a real opportunity to deal with access and distribution and discovery issues. There are technologies that we can apply. Open access publishing and the reductions of cost is one part of that, but the potential for better discovery tools that arises from good data repositories are another example. We need to mediate these many-to-many relations, and that's something that the web and search is pretty good at. Not perfect, but better than searching in print indexes. And then the third piece, how do we solve this problem of recreating a human interaction, recreating a process by which people are really engaged with the process of review and validation? And there are many ways and many tools out there at the moment that help to, in some way, restructure expert attention or restructure attention. Many of the services from Uber and Airbnb are examples of things that restructure attention in a way that potentially has the ability to solve some of these problems. If we can bring the right expert to bear at the right point in time, when an author or a researcher needs that support and criticism and validation, then that's both the point at which that expert feels that their work is most useful and most valued, and also the point at which the author or researcher is most attentive and appreciative of that advice and support. The question of how we do that and where we do it and how it works remains to be sorted out. But there's a potential there. But that's really just hand-waving, to be honest. I've sort of given you some examples and maybe thrown out some examples of consumer web properties that address some of these issues. But to be honest, that's not really solving the problem. It's certainly not solving the problem of incentives. And the answer for me until a couple of weeks ago was to say, well, we need to build infrastructures that help to solve these problems. We need to find ways to fund them and to create community governance and make that work. And that's still the answer, or still part of the answer from my perspective. But I went to a remarkable meeting which was populated in large part by economists and humanities folks a couple of weeks ago. And that's really changed the way I want to think about it, and really changed the way I think we can focus our attention on this question of infrastructure building. And I think we've actually just been thinking about the whole problem the wrong way. And I'll try and explain quickly in the last couple of minutes I've got what I mean by that. So this is a diagram that comes from Elinor Ostrom's work. Elinor Ostrom was a political scientist, but she was awarded the Nobel Prize in Economics, which gives you an idea of how clever she was and how important her work is. And she was particularly interested in the question of how communities manage what she called common pool resources. These are things like fisheries, where if you overfish, you will run out of fish, but it's difficult to stop other people coming in and fishing. So you need management systems, community systems, that help to manage that and manage it over a long time. And so she divided up goods into different categories based on this question of, are they rivalrous or non-rivalrous? So rivalrous things are ones that if I take something from you, you don't have it. So like an apple or a dollar bill. Non-rivalrous are things that if you give it to me, you still have it. So knowledge, digital files, those kinds of things are non-rivalrous. And then there's this other axis, this question of whether things are excludable. Can I stop other people using this good, or are they non-excludable? So, for instance, a file on the web is fairly non-excludable. Anyone can get at it. You can't prevent anyone from getting at it except by putting in DRM mechanisms or subscription barriers or paywalls, in which case it becomes excludable. So, or excluded at least. Fisheries are hard to keep people out of, as are grant schemes, for instance. That's the whole purpose of grant schemes. So when we've thought about these problems in the scholarly communication space, we're focused on two quadrants of this diagram. We're focused on private goods, those like money, which are rivalrous and excludable, and public goods. And we've framed a lot of our questions as, how can we persuade this person or this organization to give up its private goods, or compel this publisher, for instance, to give up the private goods of those subscription articles and make them public goods. And the interesting thing about this is that it creates, when we frame the problem that way, it creates a space in which we can only provide certain kinds of economic solutions. So the infrastructures that might support this, because they're creating public goods, probably can only really be funded by things that look a lot like taxation. The ways to make this happen, because they're public goods, because they're non-excludable, and it's sort of a global thing, have to be legal policy requirements, top-down compulsion to do the right thing. And so we frame this as a question of, let's create the data requirements policy. Let's provide an infrastructure that is, we're not too sure how to fund it, we'll get a grant to start with, and then we'll figure out how to tax the community later. And we also fundamentally frame the question of, how do we persuade a subscription publisher to convert to open access, as one of nationalization. It's fundamentally a rhetoric of nationalization. And so, as you can see from the diagram I'm building up here, the thing I've come to conclude is that this is really a false dichotomy, and it's a false dichotomy for a very important reason. I talked about how the Royal Society in its early days, and perhaps it isn't so much these days, was really a club. And there's a category at the bottom right of this diagram of things called club goods. And these are things which are non-rivalrous. If you read a journal article in a subscription journal, it doesn't stop me from reading the same journal article. But they are excludable. There's a paywall. I can put a barrier in place to prevent someone from using it. And the thing that's shifted for me is the idea that what we're talking about is not the conversion of private goods into public goods. The reason why these things have been turned into private goods was to solve some of these scaling problems. That's the gift that Maxwell gave us. But the point at which knowledge is created, it is a club good. That club might be the research group. It might be a particular institution. It might be a journal or a subscription journal. And our challenge is not to shift from private goods to public goods, but to provide the space in which club goods, in which we can persuade clubs to make these into public goods. And to do that, we can utilize the rhetoric that many of us have applied, that by giving these things and putting these in the public domain, by putting them on the web, they become part of a network, a much broader network, and then we exploit those network effects. So we need to persuade these clubs to convert club goods into public goods, but in the process of doing that, we also need to ensure that they get club goods back. And those club goods might be readership, they might be prestige, but what we need to do is set up an environment in which those clubs are confident that they will get a benefit back. And that benefit suddenly makes sense at the club level in a way that it hasn't really made it at the individual level. So the challenge is how we can make that work, how we can build infrastructures that solve that problem and make it easier for clubs to see that they will get a benefit by making things available. The other thing that's just a side issue on this is that many of the things we use to create knowledge actually fall into the category of commons. So these are things like the time of experts, grants. These are rivalrous. I can't give the same grant to two people, but they're not excludable. The whole point of grant systems is that, for the most part, that anyone can apply for them. So the question is one of how do we create services that effectively convert commons resources into club goods and infrastructures that persuade clubs that it's in their interests, and I mean economic interests in many ways, to create public goods. And there's a whole economics of viable clubs that we really haven't applied to these questions of how to build the right clubs and the right infrastructures and the right systems that will enable this to happen. Because we've been focused so much on the shift from the bottom left to the top right, and what we can do is take a step along the way that'll make that a lot easier. So the point I want to make is we really need to focus on this question of clubs and communities in a way that's a really obvious statement, but in particular on the economics and the political economics of clubs and communities. And those communities will effectively manage commons, human resources in many cases, to create these club goods. And then we need to build the infrastructures that exploit the network effects to create public goods that generate these club goods as a side effect. Like I say, things like prestige, readership, and money. The money that sustains the club and the services that it's creating. So, coming back to my original point, what I want to say is that I don't think our origin myth should focus on the journal. I think that's been a mistake. I think we need to focus on the strengths and the weaknesses of the community that created the journal, because that's where the values actually lie. And the success of that community in creating modern science is something that we should be building on, and we should understand in a very deep way if we're to actually achieve the values that those people set out. And so, just in closing, I want to come back to this equation, which is Boyle's law, because of course, while we've violated the laws that Boyle laid out around how we should do natural philosophy, it turns out we've also violated this one. The volume has increased and the pressure on researchers has increased. So we haven't held those things constant. So perhaps the lesson is to go back to what Boyle was doing and what Boyle was thinking, and to really use that as our compass to manage how we build these infrastructures and services and systems for a future of scholarly communications that actually achieves the values they were setting out 350 years ago. And I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Cameron. I just want to thank you for this thoughtful presentation. So we have time for a couple of questions, and I want to encourage anybody who's interested to please keep sending us questions, and also we want to make this as interactive as possible, so please use the online forum if you want to continue the conversation with Cameron. The first question I have for you is, somebody is wondering, do you have any thoughts on the peer or community review of the data set behind the publication of a paper? In many cases, it is just the narrative that gets the review, but wouldn't it be important, even essential, to apply critical review to the data behind the study/paper? How would you incorporate that into the review process?
I think, yeah, that's a real challenge. It's a challenge for a couple of reasons. When we do, despite the fact it doesn't feel this way, when people are peer reviewing an article or the narrative, they at least have a sense of what it is they should be doing. I don't know that we have that sense for people reviewing data. So there's actually a problem of what is the job. Problem two is there's a lot of data out there. If we're actually serious about publishing the kind of completeness of data that I'd certainly like to see, and I'm guessing most of the people on the online would like to see, that's a lot of data. And so reviewing it is a volume problem. So I've got kind of my vague answer is we need to work pretty hard at trying to find ways to computationally validate data as much as we possibly can. I think there's a real potential there, because if an article comes in with the data behind it and there's some sort of validation stamp on the data, even if it's just this checks out statistically, but potentially all the way up to this structured claim in the paper is supported by the data presented, then it will actually speed up the review process. It'll certainly, if I was an editor and I've got one paper that's got a validated data set behind it and one that doesn't, I can tell you which one I'm working on first. So I think there's a real potential there, but we haven't even scratched the surface of thinking about how to automate sort of validation and certification of data as it comes, either as it comes off, as it's published in data services, or as it comes into a formal narrative publication process. One really simple example of that is the sort of embarrassment we often have in the microarray genome-wide association studies space, where it seems to be frequently turning out that once someone actually looks at the data set and does sort of some basic sanity checking on the quality of the data itself, the statistical characteristics of the data itself, that a lot of weaker studies sort of then don't look particularly convincing. It looks like the data is basically rubbish. Well, the weaker studies, many of them published in Science. But I think there are examples where we could think about starting to work on creating basic standards of this is the validation that this kind of data should go through. And as a side effect of that, we probably have some chance of standardizing formats as well.
Great. The next question I have is, where do initiatives like F1000 or the Faculty 1000 research fit in with the whole reconnecting authors with reviewers theme? Are they doing the right thing?
So F1000 research is a really interesting experiment. I think it is, I mean, in concept, this idea of having a sense of who that is certainly on the right track. I think there are some issues around the implementation, and I think there's some questions around who should get to ask who the referees are. In the F1000 case, there's a focus on having the authors invite the referees. So that obviously potentially does make a quite strong human connection, but we also want to ensure that there's good criticism there as well. So I think it's definitely the question of, I think it's to me it's clear that the way we will improve this is by having more transparency in the review process. First, actually making the reviews available so that people can actually look at them and see what the issues were. I think the second step, obviously, having names attached to reviews, I think is valuable. And I think the other thing that will probably come along behind that is, I mean, various journals have already done this, obviously, particularly the BMC Medicine series have published a lot of their reviews for quite some time now. We also need to work on making that information useful so that people can actually use it. But I think it's definitely, there's lots of details to work out about how best to do it, but I think the move towards greater transparency and greater ability to dig into the record of the discourse and the changes and the criticism can only be a good thing. We're just going to make it useful.
Great. So to follow up on that, we have a related question. You mentioned that blind review is not the solution, as it doesn't fix the problem. We need transparency and to change the way we operate. This will take time. Given pressure to publish and the importance for tenure, promotion, and job acquisition, how do you see academic institutions partnering with publishers and the community to work on the solution you envision?
So I think the locus where this can change, and I guess this is my central point in some ways, is at the community level, the club level. And that might, there are a couple of different sort of levels or types of club that might be relevant. One of those is scholarly communities. I think there's a real opportunity for scholarly societies to step up to the plate here, because they often have a publishing operation, they have a community that they're working with. It's a community that speaks to itself and is, you know, small enough that it can do that. And they also have influence at the institutional level. So I think there's a real potential for scholarly societies to take a lead on this. There's a problem with figuring out how to get institutions and publishers working together, because they're not part of the same club. They have very different interests and very different needs. And there's I think, a pretty substantial gap between what publishers can offer and what institutions currently want. So institutions are mainly concerned about making goods decisions about who to appoint and who to promote and who to resource. And to do that honestly and in a way that's as efficient as possible and reduces the burden as much as possible. On the publisher side, what we can do is provide lots and lots more information of different types, and that doesn't necessarily solve the problem. And I think that's why it's really important to have mediating communities in the middle who really want to do this and who are able to tell the institutions that because this person has been really engaged as being a really excellent referee, that those communities can then tell that to the institutions, and then they can also be the place where the publisher side can provide that information. So I think the challenge lies in finding the communities that are ready to do this, and the right way to shift things bit by bit, and in many ways to find ways to make small changes. I know I and many others have always wanted to make big changes and to rip the whole system down and start again. Sometimes the right thing to do is to find the smallest change you can make that has the potential to make a big difference. And so, for instance, simply making the review reports available is a great step, is a great example of that kind of step. Okay,
I think we'll do one last question. I'll give you 1 minute for this very interesting question. So this person asks, what do you think about the role of emergence of natural language processing and more semantically aware machines for reviewing? I think this will be added to the formula to set up having volume and pressure managed to in UK.
So I think for me that's kind of the next, so the kind of computational validation of data I talked about. Decision support for the human referee is another way of framing the same thing, and certainly computational algorithmic support for that process I think could be really valuable, and we know we have a scaling problem, we know that. I'm a little skeptical of NLP in particular delivering very much in the short term. But I'd be very happy to be proven wrong by that, because we need all the help and the support we can get to do this better.
Great. Well, thanks again, Cameron, and thanks everyone for attending. Just a quick reminder that the recording and discussion can be found at the link that you see on this slide. And also, please, if you're interested, you can register sometime this week, maybe even today, for the upcoming webinar. And thanks again, Cameron, and thanks everybody for attending, and have a great day.